Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Talking Niagara this morning on Friday, October the 18th. Where has the month gone? I'm blinked and it's already the 18th.
Yes, I know.
And, what the heck has happened? Okay, so got some latest news from Gaza, right? Apparently, the what's his name? Crikey,
Yahya Sinwar.
Yahya Sinwar, the leader of Hamas, was killed in southern Gaza in the last on Wednesday, I think, either yesterday or Wednesday. He was killed during a fighting spout, and the Israelis didn't even know that they had him. And it occurs to me that, hey, this is almost what we need. Is like, okay, it's time for peace now.
You would think so, but Yahya Sinwar was very resistant to that, and so is his counterpart Benjamin Netanyahu.
Yeah.
I see them both as the same person, basically, same person on opposite sides. They're both ruthless. They're both blood got gallons of blood all over them. They both believe the ends justify the means. It doesn't. They have no. They both believe that sacrifices have to be done by a lot of lives to gain their means, to gain their where the goals are. Yahya Sinwar wanted to get rid of Israel altogether, get the Jews out of Palestine so the Palestinians could move back in. And Netanyahu believes the same thing. He wants the Arabs out of Gaza and West Bank and claim it all for himself too. And that's according to his Likud party as well. Yahya Sinwar was a refugee. His family was from Ashkelon, which is not far from Gaza, and he grew up as a refugee in Gaza. He was very, very intelligent man, very cold when it came to his political beliefs. He came down very hard on Palestinians who cooperated with the Israelis, and he murdered them or had them murdered. Originally, he was put in prison. In prison, he learned how to speak Hebrew better than most of his Jewish guards or the officers that were taking care of or overseeing the prison. He was let out as part of a prisoner exchange. When they had one Jewish soldiers they held for 5 years, and then they finally got this deal where they let out 1,000 Palestinians from prison. Yahya Sinwar was among them. That's the guy they shouldn't have let out. If anything, he was because he was very capable in his cold and meticulous way.
Yeah,
and he is the one that engineered the attack on Israel through the barricades that kept the Gazas inside.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It is amazing that he wasn't caught up on this because he was very blatant about it. He had his men all training. That was all obvious. It was all being filmed and notified, and yet they just drove up big front end loaders right up to the fence and ripped them down and went right in. So that falls on Netanyahu because he ensured that the Israeli people were safe from any attack from Gaza, and that's obviously was wrong. The whole idea was to get hostages so they could use them the same way they had in the past, but everything got out of control, and the Israelis then, of course, responded in the most brutal way possible. Now, Yahya Sinwar. Now, this is how the press the way it is. Like the first thing was that he was found by the most unlikely of Jewish soldiers. I think they were on a training mission or something, and they saw these three guys, armed guys, run into a house, and they were chasing them or something, or spotted them, and then they brought in a tank and blew it up. But in the meantime, they went into the house with a little drone, and there he was, just sitting there, and he took a stick and threw it at the drone, but he knew his end was up because he had been identified at least as a fighter in that home. And as soon as they found that there was him just sitting there, he was absolutely waiting for the end, it appeared, because the jig was up and he was just sitting there. And so they took a tank and blasted the place. And when they went in, they found him dead. Netanyahu wanted to say that he was running away, he was a coward, and all that other stuff. On the other hand, others say that he died fighting like he said he would, and he did. He said he'd end up dying as a soldier in the field, and that's what happened. He did. And but this is a guy that got radicalized. He was his family were forced to leave Ashkelon before he was born. They lived the life of refugees in squalid and cramped conditions, and that is the thing that most radicalized him, I believe. He studied Israeli society very carefully. He had one mission in his life, and that was to reestablish a Palestinian state where the Israeli state is now, much like the Netanyahu wants to eliminate Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank. But he's gone now, and this may be the beginning of the end. Let's hope that it is. Let's hope that the beginning is a very.
I hope so, but I fear it won't be. Right. On top of this, of course, also U.S. Secretary of State Blinken and Austin wrote. U.S. Secretary of State and U.S. Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. So Blinken is Secretary of State, and Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin wrote to Israel on Sunday demanding concrete measures to address the worsening crisis in Palestine, where at least 42,000 Palestinians have been killed, and according to the U.S. Actually, according to the local health ministry, pretty well the entire 2.3 million population is now homeless. And Israel.
Oh, yeah.
Israel is basically saying it's acting in self-defense. But Blinken and Austin want some humanitarian aid.
Well, yeah, it's long overdue. Israel has long used the starvation or deprivation tactic in Gaza. The very first, when they ran into Gaza, Gallant, their defense guy, the guy that's in charge, he said, we cut off the water, we cut off the electricity, we've cut off the food, nothing goes in. And of course, there's a lot of complaints about that because you had 40,000 Hamas fighters, but there was another 2.2 million people that weren't Hamas, and they were just ordinary people. And so to starve them all out, it's very clear that there was this collective punishment. There's a lot of serious hate on the Israeli side, as there is on the Palestinian side for their adversaries. And we find that constantly we're finding children with bullet holes in their head. You can't. I mean, a child with a bullet hole in the head, obviously not a combatant. You find that Israel had a policy, or still does have a policy, that they send the drones out, and anyone they spot, the drone spot, assume that that whoever they see is a combatant, man, woman, or child, and have them shot or killed. So it is a brutal, harsh situation the Israelis have brought up on Gaza. They've destroyed 70% of the homes. We don't know. The death toll may be well over 100,000. We do know that it's around 42,000, but they've lost the ability to collect a lot of records because those officials that used to collect those kind of records are not around, and they have to. Israel's also attacked the United Nations. It's also attacked all the charity groups, including Doctors Without Borders. They're pretty brutal. And let's just hope this damn thing ends very shortly. I don't know how Hamas can carry itself on. They're a ragtag group now. Their communications are all gone. Communications between the different units is how Israel found out where these guys are, and that's why they blast them. So if they see a bit of communications from one to another, they'll just blast that house or whatever they felt the communication came from. They have a policy of, they call it daddy's home, like that. So what they would do, they found out early on when they finally were able to track some of the combatants or leaders or political leaders. They felt that it was, they discovered it was a lot easier to kill them once they got home. So they would watch the guy until he got home and then blast the crap right out of the house and kill all the family or anyone else that was in the home. And they found that was the most efficient way of taking out their adversaries. To them, taking out the whole family was better than waiting to get them alone. I don't know why. Now there are people that are probably ready to take over for Sinwar, but they can't really operate that well because they're very well known to the Israeli Israeli IDF and Mossad. Many of those who are in line to take over have already had assassination attempts on them, some more than once, and they're probably in the hiding. So it's going to be very hard for Hamas to communicate because any means of communications is the way in which the IDF finds them, or with the help of the United States. That's probably why negotiations between Hamas broke down. They weren't getting much communication from Hamas for the peace deal because Hamas realized every time they lit up a phone or sent a message, it could be followed right back to where they were. We see what the Israelis were capable of doing in Lebanon, and how remarkable their intelligence is that they were able to even go into Iran and kill Haniyeh, who was the chief negotiator for Hamas.
Yeah.
I don't know how long Hamas is going to be able to hold out. The Israeli method of starving the people out and removing their resources isn't going to work because the United States, for the first time ever, has got a backbone and said, you better get those supplies in there because the whole world is watching. You've got United Nations people there, Doctors Without Borders people there, you have other NGOs in there, all screaming bloody murder. You're shooting kids through the head. I mean, the doctor, one of the doctors being interviewed, told about the first time he saw a kid with a bullet in his head. And he thought, well, it was kind of an accident. But then when children kept coming in with bullets in their head, obviously somebody out there, some psycho, was shooting kids.
Yeah.
And
not an accident. Yeah.
Yeah. So really, this whole situation has to be taken out of the hands of the Israelis and the Palestinians altogether. There's too much hate there. There's too much hate built up over 100 years, and that hate isn't going to go away. And right now, it's going to be very difficult to find somebody to police Gaza after this is all over. And I hope it ends today, to tell you the truth. But I don't. I think a few of the ragtag outfits of the Hamas will continue to fight, but they can't last much longer. They can't. Their weapons have got to be running out. More and more of the tunnels are being discovered. They have been a fairly effective fighting force up until now, and the fact that Yahya Sinwar was in wide open, and doing what the other Hamas guys were, and he died a soldier like he said he would. Remember, all these guys expect to be martyred, and that's another thing. Each one of them expects to be martyred. They all expect to be died, including Suleiman, which was the one that Trump killed, the Iranian commander that Trump killed. They all knew that somebody was going to catch up to him sooner or later, and that's all the Hezbollah, all the Hamas. That's all part of their mystique. Well, we're going to be martyred one day. In the meantime, we'll get we'll do as much fighting as we can before they finally get to us and martyr us. So when they kill a guy and we have to understand the relationship. We always talk about Iran and Hamas. I heard an expert the other day, and he said, well, the arrangement between Hamas and Iran is a marriage of convenience, because their ideology is distant from one another. The Hamas is a Sunni radical group. Iranians are Shias. Hezbollah are Shias. The Houthis are Shias. But the Hamas were Sunni. And Iran would probably have not approved of the attack that Yahya Sinwar did, because, of course, they knew that would ratchet all the problems that are happening now.
Yeah, but then they all knew that. We can't pretend they didn't.
Yeah, well, the Iranians are, like I said, they had a marriage of convenience with Hamas. They didn't supply them as well as Hezbollah was supplied. It's hard to get that stuff in there, and Hamas made a lot of their own weapons and all kinds of things. The tunnels they used for smuggling were originally just plain ordinary smuggling tunnels, because the Israelis have a fence around Gaza, and they have gunboats patrolling the shore, so the Gazans can't leave or come back. So in order to get the things they wanted, right, for anywhere from a TV to a sheep, and this is still going on, is they tunneled.
They just smuggle it in.
They tunneled in. Yeah, they tunneled from usually Sinai in, and they hid their stuff in tunnels as well. And those are the tunnels that were adapted by Hamas for military means. They saw the worth of that. Plus, before Hamas even was in power in Gaza, the Israelis were digging tunnels under the hospitals. Though that tunnel system that was under the hospital, where the Israelis say it was a command center for Hamas, didn't turn out to be a command center as much as they wanted you to know it. And it turns out that the Israelis were the ones that built those tunnels before they left back in 2005. They built them back in, I think, in the 80s or the 90s.
Yeah.
There's a lot of smoke and mirrors here of what's going on. But all I can do is cross my fingers every day, multiple times during the day. I think of what hell the average Palestinian has gone through in Gaza. Estimates are as much as 150,000 that might actually be dead. Certainly, there are people buried in the rubble, all kinds of them, because of the stench that people walk by, and sometimes they dig out a body or two. There are people missing. There is that new acronym, WC, was it Wounded Child, No Known Family?
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yep.
It's a brutal and horrible thing. And I believe that a lot of the atrocities that are happening to the Palestinians may not be may not be official policy by the Israelis, but so many other Israelis hate
Yeah,
the
but Benjamin
Arab
Netanyahu is just going to look the other way, you know?
Yeah, they do it with impunity,
Yeah,
And even
yeah.
you've got guys like Joe Biden who says, "Oh, a sniper bullet skipped off the ground and then hit that young lady, that young Turkish lady." Yeah,
I don't believe it.
seriously. Yeah. Oh, it was
Yeah,
an accident. He said, "A sniper
yeah,
bullet."
yeah. Okay, getting more local again. Let's look at Halloween shrinkflation. Right. So what we're talking about here is your Halloween candy bars are being trimmed down. So instead of boxes of 50 or 100, now you're going to see boxes of 45, 90 or 95, that type of thing. And even in there, the box of 45 is now smaller packaging, etc., all through shrinkflation.
Yes, shrinkflation is. This is an opinion piece, actually,
Yeah, of
and
course.
Halloween candies are not being spared from shrinkflation. Yeah, basically, if you're going to be handing out candies this year, it's going to cost you more. But you might not think that you paid a whole lot more than you have in years past, and that's basically because little by little they make the packages smaller. They
Yeah,
put there's a like they have here a list of things like, well, it says globally sugar prices are about 24% higher since May, just in May, and cocoa prices have skyrocketed by an astonishing 119%. And it goes on to say that O. Henry bars have shrunk by 7.2%, Coffee
yeah.
Crisp by 10%, M&M's by 20%, Kit Kat by 2%, that Toblerone by 10%. Halloween candies have not been spared, and also the potato chips that are fairly popular. And instead of having boxes of 50 or 100, now the boxes are 45 and 90 most of the time. And so basically, you're going to be, if you're planning to give out chocolate this Halloween, expect to pay between 15 and 27 cents per small little treat. If you just give one, most people give a couple or a few anyway. I used to make up little bags for the kids, and and that's per small item. Now these little fun bars are even smaller than they used to be, typically 17 grams. So basically, this is I threw this article in there just to go along with what's been happening in our society all
Yeah.
along. Uh, we're being somewhat deceived by the producers that we're getting the same as we did, or at least almost the same as we did in years past. We aren't.
We're not. We're not. Yeah.
And if anyone's bought a chocolate bar recently, I did. I was hungry. Like I like Snicker bars and Mars bars, and I saw this Snickers bar, so I grabbed it because I was just like, that was, I know, months ago. I don't eat very often, but
Yeah.
I remember paying for it. Like, holy cow, they cost that much.
Yeah, it was 10%, 20% more expensive and probably 20% smaller.
Yeah, and I thought a chocolate bar costs this much. And then I just thought to myself,
That's
I'm glad
exactly
glad I don't eat these that very often.
well, that was my thought of the weekend. I was in a highway service place getting gas, and there was some of these chocolate bars there, and I go, you just grab them because you kind of go, yeah, I'm going to need one of these on the journey, right?
Yeah.
And essentially there, when you look at, it's not when you're paying for it, it's not when you're thinking about it, it's when you look at the receipt later on and you go, holy moly, these have gone up, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
they've gone up 20% and they've gone down in size 25% as well.
Yeah. And well, you know what? I just thought of this. This is another contract contrast. We were talking about a little while ago just about Gaza and all the kids that are being killed and brutalized and starved. And here we're talking about, oh, what a bummer. We're going to get less candies for the buck. That's quite a contrast, don't you think? It just occurred to me now that we were talking. We're talking about, oh, what a bummer. We're going to have less candies to give away, or it was going to cost us more to give them away. But the fact is, we are going to give away candies to our kids, and kids are starving in Gaza right now and have wounds and burns and loss of parents and so on. So I just like to. The one serious thing I said at Thanksgiving dinner was just before it began. I'm not a very serious guy most of the time, but I just reminded everybody at the table. Just think of Gaza right now. As we have plenty here, just think of Gaza and the families in Gaza right now, or Ukraine, or the Sudan, or Mali, but in particular Gaza. So here we are. This is another situation of what different worlds we live in. We here in North America, bounded by two huge open oceans, are fairly safe and very prosperous country, and yet sometimes we have a hard time looking outside of our own borders. Mm-hmm. But getting back to shrinkflation, and that was just an aside, but getting back to shrinkflation, I just put that in there just to just as an illustration of what is generally happening in our society. When you think of the standard of living going down, you can see it even the amount of candy we're going to give our kids.
Yeah. Well, there was an interesting survey here that they put into that article. What kind of candy bars will you be buying for Halloween? You got the normal chocolate bars, gummies and licorice, lollipops, rockets pop, etc., etc. Chips feature in there, but there's also a couple of things here, which is I'm taking the non-candy route and giving out arts and crafts school supplies. Right?
Well, you'll be so popular.
Yeah, I was thinking that. I won't be buying candy this year. That's another one where you won't be very popular at all.
Yeah. This doesn't taste very good, but it's really healthy for you. Yeah, I was one of the kids because I like apples so much. When people used to run out of candy, they would start handing out apples from their fridge if they had any. Yeah. And I was a kid. I always loved to get the apples because I loved apples so much. But other kids thought that was kind of a ripoff. Oh man, you're digging into. Now apples are very expensive. I think it'd be the last thing that anyone would give nowadays. They would prefer to give a candy. But the fact is that I used to make up these little bags. I used to buy these treats in boxes, and they were mixed, and there were no peanuts. There's a little tag on the box, and they could come from Cadbury or they could come from Roundtree or wherever they make these things. And then I would just take about 4 of whatever's in there and put them in a little bag and hand them out, 4 or 5, I think, like that, because I never got a whole lot of kids, so I could give them a good count every time. The most I would get is maybe 20 kids, so I could give them a good count, no problem. It's not gonna hurt me. Where my brother used to live, they would get over 100 kids. And the first Halloween they were there, they thought they were okay. They had over 100. They had 100 treats, and they were handing them out. They had to go to the store and get more because they had so many kids.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, where I am, we hardly get any callers. We got one kid lives down our section of the street.
Well, what's more and more popular now is kids being driven to more affluent neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Actually, that was going on when I couldn't believe it when my kids were small. My wife had friends that lived in a very affluent neighborhood, and they said that they were trucking kids in, and I didn't really believe it until one Halloween we went over there because our kids would go out with their kids, and that's exactly what was happening. I would see car after car after car come to the street and unload their kids, and they go up and down the more so the higher end homes that were there, and they would get. And the reason why is they would get a good count. They could get better quality treats.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. I get it. All right.
Anyway, I have fond memories of Halloween, and just remember it was based on Samhain. Most of it was based on someone, and some parts of it I think were also um, reinforced by I think the birth of Minerva or something like that was a Roman thing, but Samhain was a Irish thing, and that what traced back to the pre-Christian times when when the the world of the living and the world of the dead intersected, and it was called a cross day, uh, something cross a cross season day or something like that. There's a term for it, and that is right in the middle of between the equinox and the right between right. Originally, it was right in the middle of between the equinox and the solstice. Um, Crossover day or something like that. There's a name for it anyway.
Yeah.
And then one of the popes decided to make All Saints Day on November 1st. So Halloween was All Saints Eve, Halloween, etc.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Moving on. Misophonia.
Misophonia.
Misophonia has links to anxiety and depression. And misophonia is the thing that people get if you happen to be uncomfortable when somebody scrapes their nails down a chalkboard, or you equally have an intense reaction to sounds like slurping, snoring, breathing, and chewing. I hated the chalkboard sound. I have
Yeah,
to say,
almost.
I hated the chalkboard sound.
Yeah. Now, just about everybody. Now, this is a good segue into the piece because I don't think a whole lot of people have ever heard of misophonia.
No, I must admit, I've never heard of I've never had the descript. I never knew what the name was.
Misophonia is that. So, as a segue into it, and you talked about the chalkboard squeak. Somebody would take their nails sometimes and drive everybody crazy by dragging their hands down there. And you remember that shiver and that feeling and how uncomfortable it felt, how it didn't really like ooey kind of thing. Well, people with misophonia have that with a whole lot of other sounds.
Yeah,
It's not just the chalkboard scrape, which just about everybody cringes when they hear it. It is everything. People breathing, the
yeah,
sound of people breathing, the sound of people eating, the sound of snoring, anything, and it drives them crazy. And I know somebody with misophonia, and it's an incredible thing. When they first get it, they think everybody's breathing or whistling or doing things to annoy them, and they shouldn't be doing that. And then after a while, they figure out that they're different. That's just the ordinary sounds that people make: breathing, eating, snoring,
yeah.
other
But I think
things like
the
that,
thing
and it
is,
just grates on them like the chalkboard sounds great on everyone else.
yeah, yeah. I was going to say that for most of us, I think the chalkboard sound grates on everybody, but most people, if you're not well or something, people slurping, snoring, breathing, and chewing, that kind of thing, or snoring, can drive that unwell state, can't they? They can make you feel worse than you did before, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you are you've got misophonia, all right, it just means that you're kind of having a bad day.
Yeah. So these people with misophonia have committed suicide.
Yeah. I
Because
realize.
they cannot live among people at all. Any
And
kind of sound, even a fly buzzing around, will irritate them beyond. It's just absolute torture for them,
yeah,
and it's very, very hard to get over. And here it says, well, it talks about patients with tinnitus, a persistent shrill ringing in the ear, are also likely to have psychological symptoms of depression and anxiety. Well, I've had tinnitus for a long time. I've learned to live with it. But that
yeah.
is, if you pay attention to, if I ever were to pay attention to my tinnitus, I'd go insane, and I have at different times. It's
Well,
hard to, it's hard to ignore it, but that's only an associated condition with misophonia.
yeah. Well, I get this. I also get this high pitched. I can hear very high pitched noises like the whining off a TV and things like that. And in fact, I've heard the whining off a TV from some across the telephone. I once told somebody to turn their television off when we're having a telephone conversation because I could hear the whining across their TV.
Yeah, I think probably anyone might have. Um, I think somebody with misophonia, if there was a very low sound in the background that no one else would be bothered by, they
Yeah.
would be the ones to be bothered by. Now, this,
I get the high pitched. Mine is the high pitched stuff.
yeah, I have a lot of, like right now, I have tinnitus. So my ears are always ringing, sometimes incredibly. But over the years, I've learned to deal with it. But if I ever concentrated on it for more than a few minutes, it would drive me mad.
Yeah.
So I found a way of trying to ignore it at all times.
Yeah. Yeah.
So this is very interesting how misophonia and other conditions necessarily shared mechanisms. Now, this is a clue to what might have caused it because it overlaps with other conditions. Genetic risk factors are similar to other things. Previously, research found people who experience misophonia are more likely to internalize their stress. The research team published last year also backed this up, showing strong links with personal traits such as worry, guilt, loneliness, and neuroticism. And responses.
Neuroticism.
Yeah, responses to a triggering sound can range from irritation to anger to stress that interferes with everyday life. And believe me, having known somebody with misophonia, that's just it. Yeah. It has been argued that misophonia is based on feelings of evoked irritation, anger, rather than behavioral expressions of anger itself and causes distress. That's people with autism syndrome, blah, 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 experienced misophonia, and goes on and on. So the reason why I put that in there is for somebody who comes across a person that is overly irritated by the sounds they make, whether it's a bee buzzing around the room that you could pretty much ignore, or somebody's breathing if they're a little bit stuffy.
Especially if you've got a stuffy nose.
Yeah, stuffy nose, or you whistle a little bit when you breathe.
Yeah.
Or there's television noise, anything of any kind, then don't assume that they're being overly sensitive to these things, because that was my mistake when I with a misophonia. I just thought they would get over it, no, like I did my tinnitus. No, they don't. So that's just a little information piece for people out there, that there are people with misophonia, and you may run across them here or there, and they're not about to tell you that they have it, but if you see them unduly irritated by a sound or made uncomfortable by a sound or something like that, you might be able to ferret out that this might be misophonia.
Yeah. And I guess we all have that kind of thing. You know, we all get those sort of things from time to time, but we just don't have them in the same way as misophonia sufferers have
Well, it's
them.
kind of, yeah, it's like sad. Like if you want to compare it to depression, people always get depressed. Say if a loved one that they know
Yeah.
passes away, your grandma dies, right, or something like that, and
Yeah.
you're bummed out and you're very sad. But people with chronic depression are sad for no particular reason. They just continue to be sad.
They woke up this morning and they got out the left side of the bed instead of the right, and like, whoa, man, they're bad. This world is bad.
And usually people, so to be depressed is human, but to be depressed all the time or chronically depressed about something that shouldn't depress you, and you cannot be brought out of that depression by seeing a lovely flower or a sunset or some other nice thing, that's completely different. And this is the same thing with misophonia. Like every one of us has irritations to sound somewhere along the line, but not every day, all the time.
Yeah. Yep. All right. Anything else on that?
That's just about it. I threw that in there as an interest article.
This next one is actually quite an in-depth thing, but historical. Pamela Harriman, Churchill's secret weapon in the fight against the Nazis. Well, when that was the original headline, and I'm thinking fight against the Nazis, but in fact, actually, I'm thinking she must have been some spy or something that was heading out into Europe, especially when I hear that she spoke about a dozen languages. But in fact, what she was wining and dining the most influential Americans and trying to win them over to the British cause against the Nazis.
Called the greatest courtesan of her era.
Yeah.
She used sex. Well, the story is Pamela Churchill was Winston Churchill's daughter-in-law.
Yeah.
And Randolph Churchill made it very clear. He went off to war, the Second World War. He was convinced that he was going to die, but in the meantime, he wanted to have a child, especially a son, if that could be happened. But so he made a marriage of convenience with this woman, Pamela, and he said to her, and she was from reasonably humble means, sort of a lesser of the aristocracy, I imagine. And he said to her, look, I don't love you or anything like that. But what I want to do is to make sure I procreate before I go off to war and die. And he wasn't really a nice guy or anything like that. And so that's what she did. She married him as a matter of convenience, and she bore him a son. And but then thereafter, he took off. He's no interest in her. But Winston Churchill did. He saw her talents. And what she did was slept around during the time that Britain was alone in the war. They're the only ones fighting the Nazis that hadn't been overwhelmed, like the French and the Poles and everyone else had been. There's a time there where Britain stood alone against the Nazis, and they really needed American help. They couldn't get, even if the Americans didn't join the war, they needed their help. So she went around and slept around with generals and ambassadors and everything else. So she used sex to get information out of them, and also to convince them to join the British effort, or to see the British effort as a more urgent means. She worked for Winston Churchill, and Winston Churchill knew all about this, and she just happened to be a really good courtesan. And man, she was a really good sleep around. She slept with dozens of men. When she did marry someone, though, later in life, she was a pretty loyal wife, but it didn't stop her, and that was the means by which she was able to court power, and the means by which she was able to help Britain and its relationships with the United States and make them more favorable. Funny how the world really works behind the scenes, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
But anyway, she eventually came to the States, and then she eventually became, I think, the ambassador of France for the United States.
Yeah.
And quite a fascinating woman. And of course, she is slurred by feminists and stuff like that, who said that they just used sex to get the way she was. But she was unapologetic for that. That was the only thing she had. She didn't have education, high-end education. She didn't have what men have in a place of power. But what she had was her body and how to extract information using sex. So,
well, and how to influence people using sex.
Yeah, and anyway,
because at one point, particularly America, during 1940 and 1940 and early parts of 1941, it was an uphill battle to try and get the US to come over to the thoughts of war, because they were so isolationist generally.
Yeah, what the Americans are doing in Ukraine right now is what they ended up doing for the first couple of years of the war. The first couple of years of the war, they decided it's better to keep Britain full of as many munitions as they needed, so the Americans wouldn't have to come into the war. So they didn't want to see Britain fall, so they filled it up with munitions, kind of like what they're doing to Ukraine right now. And when Japan attacked the United States in December of 1941, the war had already been going on for
It'd already been going 2 years at that point. Yeah,
it'd be going on for 2 years. In Britain, it was still Britain and Russia now were allies, and so the United States declared war on Japan, but it did not declare war on Nazi Germany.
Yeah,
and this was a great fear of Churchill. At least he had an ally against the Japanese in the Pacific, but he still had to fight the biggest threat, which was the Nazis. Thankfully, like the Americans were still against that European war by and large.
Yeah.
And Hitler declared war on the USA. It wasn't the USA that declared war on Germany. They declared war on Japan, but did not declare war on Germany. It was Hitler that declared war on the United States.
Yep.
And that's what brought them into the European war. They might not have even got into the European war if it hadn't been for that. Because even in the early parts of the war, the American public was very much against it. In fact, even around D-Day time, 40% of the Americans were still against that war.
There was a lot
isolationists.
Yeah, there was a lot of issues in America with the Second World War, because as soon as the body bags started coming home, particularly on the European front, you know, and they're talking about German Americans saying that they're fighting Germans and that kind of thing. You know, so German Americans fighting Germans was a thing that was problematic. You know, Austrian Americans fighting Austrians was also problematic, as many of the Americans and their isolationist policies were basically trying to keep well away from the European conflict of war.
Yeah, they had already bailed out Europe in the First World War.
Yeah.
Now they're being asked to do it again, and they're kind of fed up with it. And that's why you hear a number of stories from the war where, let's say, like in the city of Caen or another city, where maybe the British and the Canadians overwhelmed Caen, And what they would do then, they had to stay. They were then evacuated from the city, and they would have a bunch of American troops with cameras march through Cannes or some other city and say the American forces have defeated the Nazis in this city, and that would be extremely irritating to the other allies, the Canadians, the New Zealanders, but that was an intended plan to sell the war in the United States. So, particularly early on in the after Normandy invasion, they still had to stoke the patriotism of the Americans, who were still at that time, by and large, 40% against the European war.
And when they had losses in the Africa, North Africa fighting, that was also something that was very hard to report back home.
Yeah. They didn't. The British had been beat up pretty good by Rommel, and the Americans, when they landed and they went to fight Rommel, they didn't take the advice the British had given them. Look, we used to do what you're about to do, and we got beat bad. Don't do that. Well, the Americans didn't pay any attention to them. They got beat up pretty good in the first couple of battles, but then of course they learned. But the Nazis were on the back foot at that time. As soon as the Americans got into the war, it was just a matter of time before it was over.
But then, for example, when the American troops landed in Italy, for the British, the Italian invasion was not more than just supposed to be kind of a diversion to the Germans, to make the Germans think that that was the main land European invasion, and that Italy could be sacrificed, right? But in reality, they were always intending to come. They had been for a long time planning to come through Normandy.
They had, but Churchill had been resisting it, and he was the one that said go and attack the soft underbelly of Europe. But Italy was a very difficult place to fight.
The
Germans put up quite a bit of resistance. And America, it was a mistake to go up through Italy. And that was because Churchill wanted to avoid. He wanted the Soviets to do all the fighting. He wanted the Soviets and the Germans to exhaust themselves completely before they landed any troops in Normandy. And remember too, he had a similar plan in Gallipoli. It was his plan. And Gallipoli during the First World War, where they had a huge invasion of Allies onto the shores of Gallipoli, and they were to take over the Dardanelles. Well, they got beat up pretty good.
Oh yeah,
and he didn't want that repeated in Normandy.
Yeah, but again, I think that the Americans felt that they were used, and they lost a lot of people in Italy. And there was a lot of feeling back home in America that they were being used by the British during the Italian invasion.
Well, kind of they were, because Churchill's remember, the Brits had a much different view of things. They had been exhausted. They'd been fighting the war 2 years longer than the Americans.
Oh, I know, yeah.
And they were exhausted. Their supplies had run out. They were spent. Their resources were all over the world. They were also fighting with the Japanese as well as the Americans were. So they were looking for a way of preserving as many resources as possible. But the Americans had endless resources.
Yeah,
and they had,
or at least they thought. Yeah.
Now, to give you an idea of the difference of how the Russians fought most of the war, and the general theory is, the general reality is that 8/10 of all German soldiers died on the Eastern Front.
Yeah.
They lost 9 million soldiers. The United States lost 405,000 soldiers in both theaters of war. The Germans lost 9 million. The Russians lost 12 or 13 million soldiers, and the Americans lost 400,000. The Brits lost about 400. Brits and their allies, including Canadians, lost about 400,000. They don't even make up a million. And there were 12 million Russian soldiers died. 12 million, just soldiers. 28 million people died in Russia.
But again, part of that, of course, is that any Russians, any Red Army that were captured were taken to places like Auschwitz. Should they be captured, they were treated much worse than any Jew in Auschwitz and those types of camps. And and they were often the first in the gas chambers.
So basically, there were 50 soldiers, 50 Russian soldiers died for every American soldier.
Yeah. But you see, that Eastern Front of the war was an ongoing thing. When you think about what happened in France, yes, the Battle of Britain happened, but the Battle of Britain happened in 1940 and 1941 and abated in 1941 when the Germans couldn't get a foothold in Britain. And the West, the Germans controlled France totally, either through the Vichy government or through their own control in Paris. And the East was where the primary conflict was. Yes, there was fighting in Africa, but that was
Well, give you an idea.
Yeah, to what was going on in the Eastern Front.
The turning point in North Africa was El Alamein, and the Brits were able to turn away Rommel finally at El Alamein. And there was thousands of soldiers died. But there, at around the same time in 1942 was Stalingrad. And there was a minimum of 1 million soldiers died there.
Yeah.
Minimum of 1 million soldiers died on that front. And maybe tens of thousands died in El Alamein. But those are two huge battles, two important battles of the war, the turning points of the war. So it gives you an idea of the scope, how much the Russians suffered. Now, on the other hand, the Americans paid for 80% of the war. So the Russians fought 80% of the war, and the Americans paid for 80% of the war. The one thing we always forget about the war is the incredible manufacturing capability of the United States that pretty much saved the world. If we couldn't produce the tanks, the trucks, the planes, particularly the Liberty ships, something as banal as a Liberty ship, a lot of these were British designs, like the Merlin engine and so on and so forth, but they couldn't produce them fast enough in Britain.
Well, especially when you consider that pretty well everywhere in Britain was within range, everywhere in England, which is where the majority of the manufacturing was, and even in southern Wales, etc., was within bomber range of Nazi Germany. Yeah,
Luftwaffe. Yeah. But in any case, we're getting off topic here.
We are massively, but yeah.
And I don't even know what topic we were on.
We were
Pamela
talking.
Harriman, yeah.
So Pamela Harriman.
Anyways, it was just an interesting story that I added. Just an interesting thing I added, because normally we just talk about news and stuff like that. And this was a person that is nearly forgotten in history right now, and she was very, very important in the war effort. And we think of tanks and guns and all that other things, but we don't think of someone who is sent to sleep with an American general by Winston Churchill.
No, that's kind of ironic, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And I'll just cover these by headlines, and we can maybe talk about one of these next week. The Dutch are floating an idea of deporting rejected African asylum seekers to Uganda. I don't know about what Uganda thinks of that. Next one is the Feds and the Blomberg are basically saying, well, are reporting that Alberta's premier is saying that Feds and the province must work together to tackle Canada's productivity crisis. And the third one in here is that Trump is acting more erratic day by day, and that's raising alarm in certain areas of his campaign.
I doubt that we raised too much alarms. But in any case, the one about they're trying to eject people, like the Europeans are fed up with the amount of immigration that's happening, very much like the Americans are, and they're talking about just picking up the African ones and dumping them into Uganda until they can find out how to get them back to their places of origin. These have all been rejected as refugee claimants, and so they have to find a place to put them. Otherwise, they're going to be stuck with them. And then eventually, of course, then it'll be a burden on the society. So now we have that going on. The British have tried that with Rwanda, and I'm not so sure that the Ugandans are too happy about this. The one about the Feds and the provinces working together to tackle productivity, that's that productivity thing that keeps coming up over and over and over.
Yeah, we talked about it a number of times. Productivity is where Canadian, is where the Canadian, it's a Canadian disease right now.
Yes, and and it's been called by the Bank of Canada basically an emergency.
Yeah.
Break the glass emergency. That's how important it is to our way of life. We are dismally unproductive.
Yeah.
And as we said yesterday, if Canada makes 70 widgets, the United States makes 100. If Canada makes 70 widgets, French make 90. So everybody does it better than us. We're the worst in the G7. Maybe the same as Italy, but that's about it.
Yes, yeah, and that's the problem. When you're looking at the same types of widget, the number that you make in an hour, our productivity is very, very low.
Yeah, it's alarming. And they're going to have to unify all the provinces and all that. We have outdated means of interacting between government and industry. We have all kinds of mines that could be opened up. I found out the other day that 46% of the gold, Canada is the fourth largest gold producer in the world.
Yep.
And yet there's an enormous market for gold. And yet we can't get any more mines opened up. In Ontario, they have 46. We produce 46% of the gold to Canada, nearly half of what Canada does, and yet we can't get mines opened up. And because there's this long process by which to open up a mine, we could be taking advantage of a lot of those things. We could be taking advantage of our liquid natural gas, but we never set up for that. Right now, Europe is starving for liquefied natural gas. In Canada, if they had planned correctly for this, could have been selling all kinds of it to them, particularly now the tap shut off from Russia. So, anyway, I think we probably bring it to an end. And I thank everybody for listening to us, particularly when we straight off the beaten path there with the Second World War. But I hope
but those were important topics, and it was an interesting perspective on the Second World War.
Yes, indeed, from that of Pamela Harriman, who used sex to advance the cause of Britain, and then later on used sex again to influence American politics. You got to use your talent where your talent is.
Yep. All right. Well, and thank you for listening this week. Short week, but hey, it's been a pleasure having everybody.
Yes, and without further ado, I bid you adieu. Pray for peace.